So this is Foundations of Sexual Violence, Part 2, and welcome. Let's get started. So like I already said, this is part 2 of the webinar, and in this one, we're really going to be focusing on the details and what is sexual violence advocacy, and what does that mean for sexual violence advocates. So we're going to cover two main ideas during this session. But again, the victim counselor training will go much more in depth about a lot of the topics that we are going to breeze over today. We know that you're going to need much more than 90 minutes to learn all these things, as well as to practice these skills. Additionally, right, this training is for new sexual violence responders, again, typically who have been on this job for less than a year. So even with that, we still highly suggest additional webinar topics for you to review that you can ask our training team about. So reach out if you would like to know more about that. And we also suggest that you do training at your agency to enhance these skills. So here are our objectives for today. First, we're going to recap part 1 of the training. Then we're going to identify the role of the sexual violence advocate before ending our training today with identifying and practicing key skills for providing emotional support to sexual violence survivors. So we're going to do a recap of part 1. And as a reminder, this webinar is already on our YouTube channel, for those of you who weren't able to attend when we did it 2 weeks ago. Sexual violence is any type of unwanted conduct that happens without a person's consent. And this includes a wide range of actions of behaviors, both including contact behaviors and non-contact behaviors. And even though they may not be physical, all types of sexual violence are violence, and they are just that, right? So society may have this idea that just because it is not physical or it is not outwardly aggressive, that it's not as bad or as traumatic, and that's not true. We also talked about how the trauma of sexual violence can impact survivors throughout their lives in a variety of ways. And we also know that as people grow and change and develop, the way trauma impacts their life may also change. Sexual violence has also many individual, familial, community, and society-wide impacts. And we also talked about what happens to the individual impacts our larger community in a variety of ways, and what happens to communities also impacts individuals. Sexual violence also intersects with domestic violence, but it's distinct and different, right? And so, again, what we say about this is that if the needs are different and the relationships are different, then the advocacy that we provide to sexual violence survivors needs to also be different. If we're just replicating what we've done for domestic violence services, and really, if we're just replicating what we've done for intimate partner violence survivors, we will miss a lot of survivors who have different experiences and relationships with the person that harmed them. The other component that we focused on in part 1 was what made up the attributes of quality sexual violence programs. Now, these attributes came a part of when we did research with other dual and multi-service programs about what they did to enhance services, able to try to meet the needs of all survivors in their communities. They based their services upon the needs of survivors in that community. They supported survivors across the lifespan as they grew and developed. So they had services that were not only for people who immediately experienced sexual violence, but also long-term, whether that's years or decades later, and also services that were responsive to different survivors' ages, from children all the way up to elder adults. They also had a wide of services available outside of criminal legal response. They had many community partners to meet the needs of survivors in the community, and the advocates and the service providers were skilled at providing emotional support. We also discussed the needs of sexual violence survivors in part 1, and they will be at the core of everything that we discuss today. So it's important that we remember these things. So we know, right, that every survivor is different and has a unique experience that's shaped by their culture, identity, and what's happened in their life. But at the core, when we asked survivors what they need, many survivors said that they needed to be believed, receive comprehensive and non-judgmental emotional support, and access to healing and safety. Today, the training will mostly center about how we as advocates can facilitate that in our professional roles and with our interpersonal skills. So let's get right into it, right? The role of the advocate. What should we as sexual violence advocates be doing? What are the main things that we should strive to be doing and provide in our advocacy? Overwhelmingly, the reason that there are sexual violence advocates is to support the well-being of sexual violence survivors. And while that might seem kind of self-explanatory, we've broken that down into four distinct roles. Help survivors access healing and safety, to model and practice skills that support survivors feeling calm and in control, to connect survivors with information and resources, and to collaborate with others to improve conditions for survivors. Now, we specifically and intentionally highlight these roles because they embody those principles of trauma-informed care while making space for all, and we do say all the experiences, stories, and pathways to healing a survivor could take. So wherever a survivor is in their healing journey, each of these roles can help advocates connect to them and connect that survivor what they need. Also line up directly with those needs identified by sexual violence survivors, right? So remember, their needs are to be believed, to receive holistic and non-judgmental emotional support, and also to have access to healing and justice. And so we're going to talk about each of the roles in more depth. Thank you, Ari. And so Ari is going to be really, really busy today because she's going to give you all a lot of different resources. And so, again, this is just kind of an overview of the foundations of sexual violence. So be ready for that. So the first role of the advocate is to help survivors access healing and safety. And this is the first and guiding role of the advocates. Again, it's really important for us as advocates and sexual violence responders in general to know that particularly sexual violence survivors have concerns that usually extend far more than just physical safety. And it usually goes beyond that first or continuous instance of sexual violence. So that means we should be helping them find safety. And again, it's just not that physical safety. And for some survivors, this might be important. For example, if they are experiencing sexual violence in the context of someone that they're living with. But it's not just about removing someone from that immediate dangerous location. For sexual violence survivors, it means finding safety in all of these different areas that are on the slide. So we call this the areas of hurt and healing. And this is the way that we have started explaining how survivors can find healing in the places that they might have also experienced some pain, hurt, or trauma. Now, what we found is that when survivors experience sexual violence, there is usually some type of hurt or trauma in each of the different areas of their lives. And that means when we talk about healing, we can't just focus on hurt in my body, right? We can't just tell people, oh, you need help, go to therapy, and get away from that person, right? That's not going to be the only area that's affected by sexual violence. So that's not going to be the only place that they need to find healing. We also found that when there is healing or change in one of these areas, there's also healing or change in the others. So, for example, we're going to go back to Marco, and we're going to give you all a copy of that slide a little later. But let's talk about Marco a little bit more. So if he is able to join a cumbia band after he leaves his old school, this may be a way for him to reconnect with his culture and find a sense of community and new relationships with other people around his age, right? So not only just culture, but relationships. And this is how healing works, right? There's change in one, there's usually change in the others. So all that is to say that the role of the advocate is to help survivors find healing and safety, and this has to be survivor defined. We should be asking survivors what they need to find healing to hold those accountable for who harmed them, and not just stopping and offering our normal standard menu of services. But healing cannot happen if survivors are not able to meet their basic needs. Healing from sexual violence is like a wound on so many levels of survivors' lives. And if people are constantly in crisis and in survival mode, then they can't focus on healing. Ari's going to put another worksheet in the chat you can use to give to survivors when asking them multiple questions about healing from each of those different areas. But in our advocacy, here are some reflection questions that we can ask ourselves and our programs about that first role. What does a survivor need to feel safe? What helps them heal? What is blocking them from feeling safe? And what can we do to get them help or to help them feel better? And remember, the thing that's blocking them doesn't have to be physical. It can be they're struggling with their mental health. It can be dealing with their coworker who's calling them slurs at work, right? As an advocate, because we want to help survivors find healing in all areas of their life, we need to make sure that we have a range of resources and referrals ready to provide assistance. How can the advocate help survivors make space for healing in their lives? What is impacting survivors in our communities? And what can you and your agency do to change that? For this last point, we also want to remember that a lot of our roles are sexual violence advocates. And by definition, we're change makers. And so it's part of our role to know what is impacting survivors in our community and strategize with survivors and their supporters to change those things for the better. And so Ari has already put that really cool worksheet in the chat. We're really proud of that worksheet because not only does it have a cactus, we were able to encompass all these ideas about the areas of hurt and healing. The second skill is modeling and practicing skills that support survivors in feeling calm, regulated, and also in control. Now in Iowa, Code of Conduct for Advocates is our code of ethics. And Ari, I'm sure, has already put that in the chat for your reference. This is a comprehensive overview that also goes into detail about the behavior advocates should use in practice and the ethical ways that we should be in contact with survivors. But for our everyday work, it means that advocates should serve as an example of what it's like to have a functioning and transparent relationship with another adult, even if that other adult has something that the survivor might need. With many survivors of sexual violence, they have complicated relationships with people in power or people who have access to their needs because of past hurt and trauma. They may not or may not have a lot of experience with having a safe, non-judgmental space to express their emotions. And this is all the emotions, but particularly fear, anger, anxiety, and not just being able to express those emotions, but also to have them validated. They may not have relationships that are mutual and respectful, that are honest and practice proactive communication, or know how to have skills that help them navigate small and significant challenges in their lives. Some example of things that we can do is be organized and readily available. We can practice proactively communicating when there are changes in our schedules or our abilities. We can model how to calmly disagree with people and still have a relationship after, and model and practice how to create, maintain, and ask about boundaries. We can also model how to show up and support people without an ulterior motive or trying to manipulate them in some way. And this is also being upfront about our mistakes and following through on the steps needed to fix those mistakes. Particularly when it comes to being forthcoming, we need to show survivors what it can look like to be in a relationship with the person who's forthcoming, firm, and kind. So, for example, we know one of the primary ethical responsibilities of advocates is to maintain the confidentiality of survivors. So, how are we explaining this in a way that survivors understand? And if there's ever a situation where confidentiality must be broken, and again, this is not our first resort, but where confidentiality must be broken, how do we do that in a way that causes the least amount of trauma to the life of the survivor? We also have to understand the policies and ethics that guide our work. And how does that align also with our agency's practices and procedures? Not knowing these can not only impact the life of the survivor, can also have consequences for our jobs and agency funding, along with the potential lawsuit. Also, along these same lines, right? As advocates, we don't do survivors any favors if we don't have boundaries and enforce the boundaries of our own. And so that can be part of the modeling and practicing these skills too. And just want to add that these boundaries don't need to just start and stop with our interactions with survivors, but also with the other people in our lives, including folks at our own organizations. So these are questions that we can reflect on regarding our own behavior and being a peer model with and for survivors. How can we demonstrate trust, respect, and choice while working with survivors and beyond? Right? And so we don't want to just demonstrate trust with survivors and then use that as a mask. We want to make sure that we're demonstrating this in all of our relationships. And we specifically highlighted trust, respect, and choice because these are some of the aspects that we talk about in our advanced training when it comes to building and maintaining a relationship. What skills does the survivor have, or what skills does the survivor want to improve on? And how can we help them with that? And remember, this isn't us identifying sports survivors like you need to be more organized or you need to do X, Y, and Z or have these skills. We could say things like, I see you're struggling, or you told me that you're struggling with remembering to eat. Would you like to talk about that? Or better yet, for them to tell us, hey, I want to work on paying my bills on time, or I want to work on being my phone less. Let them set and identify what it is they want to work on in their own lives. What practice examples and tools will help the survivor feel in control and regulated? Particularly when it comes to this point, we're going to talk about safety planning and grounding skills later on in the training, and this can be really helpful for survivors. We also need to be able to connect survivors with what they need, both tangible and intangible. So part of the reason why is because for people to feel safe, they need to know what options are available, right? And so it's not just having the things, but knowing how to use them. What good is being able to have a great piece of technology if I have no idea how to use it, right? And that includes informed choices and informed consent. So if we have information that we know could be helpful in the lives of survivors, we need to think about how we're going to proactively share that in a way that they understand and that's accessible. And not just language accessibility, but also making sure that we can do so in written and verbal formats. This also looks like informed consent, right? And so I gave a training last week, and we talked about how I'm even guilty of this myself. How when we are on social media or things like that, there might be a long, long contract that we might just scroll to the bottom and click I accept, right? But how can we give informed consent if we're not really understanding and knowing what it is that we're interacting with? And this is the same thing that we need to remember when survivors are interacting with our services. Even if it takes longer than we expected, we need to make sure that survivors understand what they're getting into when they're interacting with us. We need to make sure that we have resources that are non-tangible, and advocacy centers can be resources ourselves or create them. And when I say this, I'm really talking about our advocacy programs, and if we call them centers, should be places where people can go in a location, a physical location, to receive what it is they need: internet access, food, clothing, shelter. And some of you may not have shelters attached, but that's why it's important to have collaborations where that can be provided, right? We also want to make sure that we're providing informed, accurate, and relevant referrals to survivors. And if we don't have the steps or the funds or the capacity to get the survivors the things that they need, we have collaborations and partners who do. I also want to take one step back and talk a little bit more about referrals. So all a referral is a reference to other types of resources, right? These resources can be both formal and informal, but they need to be responsive and reflective to the needs in our community. So if we're constantly getting referrals for childcare waivers, right, then maybe some of our advocacy efforts should be with people who can provide them, and have a list of childcare providers who are vetted by our programs or by the coalition for low cost, or even better, no cost to survivors. Excuse me. So our next question is, what revolve around, again, making sure survivors have resources and information. We can't know the types of resources and referrals that we need to have if we're not connected to the needs of sexual violence survivors in our communities. And the only way that we're going to know that is by asking them directly. From when we ask survivors, what are the things that they most often request, and how can our agency get those things? What questions do survivors have, right? So not just having things that we can give them, but also information. What questions do survivors have when interacting with our services, our partners, or about our community? How can we ensure that they have that information in a trauma-informed, accessible way, right? So this isn't just handing people pamphlets, although that may be helpful for getting some initial information, but also making sure that they have all the information that they need to make informed choices that are best for them. How we proactively share information with survivors so that they can make the best choice for themselves. And this again is not just about making sure that they have the written information, but having information that is about at a third grade level, that is written and also said auditorily, so for people who learn in different ways. And then our last role, okay, that's Ari putting stuff in the chat. Thank you, Ari. Our last role is to collaborate with others to improve conditions for survivors. Collaborations are the way that we reach communities that we aren't involved with and ensure that no matter where survivors seek help, they are getting the support that they need. This means that when our funding changes or there are other changes in society, our partnerships can make sure that survivors get what they need without gaps, and can also help us amplify the needs of survivors and the issues that impact them within our communities and beyond. Collaborations can also help us minimize the individual effort we contribute, but maximize and coordinate the overall effort and influence of our collective power. Instead of replicating the same thing, we can coordinate our different approaches, right? So one of our partners can focus on outreaching to men. One can do outreach to incarcerated survivors, and the other can focus on doing outreach to college students, right? We can all share the same goal, but use different resources and approaches to make sure that we're still doing the best and reaching all survivors, right? So this might look at the formal level like an MOU and contract. Those happen at the agency level. As advocates, we still have an individual responsibility to have connections in the community to improve things for survivors. So for example, the survivor we're working with might really like animals, and particularly dogs. if we have a relationship with the court-approved therapy dog handler, that can be really helpful with the survivors that we work with. And then later, maybe later on, we can formalize that relationship with our whole agency. But it has to start somewhere. So why not you? Advocates also make collaborations to ensure spaces for survivors' voices not to only be heard, but also to work with others to improve the processes, practices, and policies and make sure that they are survivor-centered. So sexual assault response teams are a good example of this, but there are so many ways to meet survivors' needs through collaboration. This also makes it so when we have collaborations that we and our organization can focus on survivors' needs and don't have to try and prioritize everything else, right? Instead, when we have those quality partnerships, we increase the number of access points survivors have in the community, and we smooth out the process for survivors reaching the support that we offer. So this can include people that we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, but it can also include like the hospital insurance policy, or it can include defense attorneys, right? Or document preparers. And again, the types of relationships and collaborations we have to be directly reflective of the needs of survivors in our community. And I'm going to sound like a broken record by the end of that, but I truly mean that. And so resources that I'm seeking out in my area where I live are not going to be the same as where Ari lives, right? Because we have our communities have different experiences and different needs. Okay, so our first discussion question of today, and you can feel free, again, I will not say what your name is out loud, I'm just going to read them on the screen. Beyond these groups, who do you collaborate with to meet survivors' needs? And this can be you individually or your organization. So beyond law enforcement, prosecutors, sexual assault nurse or forensic examiners, court officials and judges, legal aid, and food banks, who else do you all collaborate with? Well, yeah, that's a great collaboration to have. Oh, someone said the DMV. I'd love to learn more about what you all are doing. That's so cool. Churches, refugee centers, landlords, absolutely, right? Yeah. Who else? Someone else said churches? Yeah. Hospitals? Mm-hmm. Who else? Okay. Looks like responses have slowed down. But thank you all so much for your participation. Someone said WIC offices, community health centers. Those are great answers as well. Thank you. Some ideas, and some of these that you all have already said, are faith centers, diaper banks, gyms, yoga studios, farms, particularly for survivors who really enjoy being in contact with nature or enjoy animals, STI testing centers, and community centers, right? Really, any place that has center in its name is a good place to start because these are places that people are gathering to receive some type of support. And so, even if you don't have these specific resources in your community, this is an opportunity to get together as a staff and reflect on the needs of survivors and think, could we serve as one of these places in the community? And if the answer is no, that's okay. How do we get connected and have collaborations that can do that? And for our last set of reflection questions, where do survivors in our communities go to socialize, receive support, and find direction? Right. And so when people say they want support, these are kind of the things that they need, right? They want to get connected to other people, they want leadership or direction, and they want some kind of relief, right? How are we in our organizations connected to these spaces? Where are places that survivors go to gather in our communities, right? Do we even know where those places are? And how do we interact and outreach to those places and spaces? Who do we currently partner with and why? And what does that partnership look like? Is that partnership benefiting survivors? Is that partnership benefiting our organization? And what can we do to improve it? And again, this last question directly goes back to the needs of survivors in our communities. What connections do survivors want us to have? And how do we seek those out? So we just went through the four roles of the advocates, but connected to that, we also have some things that advocates need to know and believe, right? And so this also helps guide our work and the individual things that we do as advocates. Advocates need to know and believe that everyone is impacted by sexual violence. Even if they have not directly experienced it themselves, we live in a culture where sexual violence is talked about, shown in TV and movies, it changes policies, and for us, motivates our advocacy. So we know and we can see how everyone in our society is affected by sexual violence, and so we all have a responsibility to help end it in different ways. We also know that trauma impacts everyone in different ways, and it's not our place as advocates to judge and put labels about how someone has coped with their trauma. We also have to believe that survivors are capable of healing and know what's best for their lives. And we also know that if you've been to any of Iowa classes training or received TA or technical assistance from us, we're usually not in a place to say, or in a place that we like to say, do or don't do something. But these are things that we feel pretty confident in when we're talking about advocacy. So Ari has also put another resource in the chat that kind of defines the role of the advocate and has some other reflection questions for you all to look at for your own practice. Advocates should be doing, advocates should and do assist survivors with tasks and achieve goals, help survivors identify options and choices available, and provide consistent support when asked. Advocates do not do things for survivors without permission. They do not make decisions for survivors or give opinions on choices, right? So if we disagree with something that survivors doing, they should never know that. That is not our role in life to judge or to decide for survivors. And we should also not be surveillancing survivors' activities, right? We provide support when asked. All right. So now we're switching over to our main focus of today, which is providing emotional support to sexual violence survivors. So we are about at the halfway point in our training. So I just want to stop here to see if there are any questions. Okay. If there are, just put them in the QA box. And Ari can also stop me if there's some that I'm not seeing. Let's go ahead and get back into the training. So first, what is emotional support? We define emotional support as the way we connect with survivors and start understanding their traumas, hurts, joys, and how that connects to their healing. And so we already gave you all the resource about the areas of hurt and healing. And so this, again, all the things that we're talking about are connected. So when we're providing emotional support, we want to make sure that we remember that whatever the person used to cope is what helped them survive to get to that point. So we don't say things like healthy or unhealthy coping, right? Instead, we say whatever the survivor needed is what they needed to relieve the pain in that moment. Yeah. So someone asked a question. Can you talk a little bit at some point about healing can't happen if basic needs aren't being met? I think we're seeing more and more folks struggle with basic needs. Yes, right? So healing is like a wound that we might experience on our body, right? If we're constantly moving, we're not able to sit still and not agitate the wound, it's not going to be able to heal, right? Or it might heal, but it might not heal in the best way possible. And we might have to correct what's happened to move on with our lives, to move on with our healing process, right? And so part of the role of the advocate is making space and helping survivors receive their basic needs, right? And I know that some of our funding restricts that, right? But this is why we have to have those collaborations available to be able to meet basic needs. And I agree with that statement. I think more and more we are seeing people struggle with basic needs, right? So how does that need to shift our funding focuses and the relationships and connections we have to people who provide those basic needs, right? And I'm not just talking about getting funds that can meet that need. I'm talking about what other resources, including offering our space up, including staff time, do we have that can be exchanged to help survivors get what they need? And if you want more specific tea on that, please reach out to our training team or you can reach out to me directly. And if I didn't answer your question, feel free to ask a follow-up question in the Q&A. Thank you so much. We also want to remember that when we're providing advocacy, that advocates hold some power and authority in that space. So not only are we a formal service provider and we're being paid for this work, but we also know that we can be the gates that stand in between the survivor and the resources that they need. So when we're interacting with survivors, we always need to keep this at the first and forefront of our minds. We also want to remember to be empathetic, transparent, warm, and yet clear when we're interacting with survivors. And we also want to remember that emotional support is a service. Some of the feedback that we've gotten about sexual violence advocacy is like, I feel like I didn't do anything. All I did was listen to them. And I want to validate that that is, again, one of the key things that survivors have identified they need. They need to be believed and have access to that emotional support. But if that's all you're able to do for a survivor, you are providing that quality advocacy. So when we're providing emotional support, we want to try to stay away from focusing on things other than what the survivor is sharing. So I know that I, in particular, am a big stickler when it comes to completing quality intakes, right? And all of these things have its time and place. And if the survivor is sharing about their trauma, they're opening up with us, or even if they're not, we still want to make sure that we're focusing on their needs and their priorities and not other things that come along with our work, including administrative paperwork. Not saying it's not important, but that becomes after meeting survivors' needs. We also don't want to be judgmental about the survivors' experiences and choices. And we don't want to move to rushing to find solutions or resources before the survivor is ready. We want to remember that survivors lead the process, not us. And that's not guided by the time that we spend with them individually, not by our grant objectives, although that does guide our funding, not dissuading that. But instead, again, we should be guided by survivors' needs. And also, what we might think is a clear and obvious solution might not be the one for survivors. And what we should prioritize is what they want and what they need. And so here are the 5 skills that advocates need to do, that we believe advocates need to do and be comfortable with in order to provide emotional support. Empathetic and active listening, choice points, safety planning, grounding, and boundary work. And you might look at this list and also say, I remember, or I've heard some things also about crisis response, and these are some of the skills too. Yeah, a lot of this can overlap, but we don't necessarily just say crisis response because these things may not just be when survivors are in a crisis. This can help survivors navigate everyday situations in their lives. The first skill, empathetic and active listening. We define this as showing support and validation in a way that conveys belief and increases connection. This is the foundational skill of the 5. So if we're not able to do this, we won't be able to do the other 4. And this is important because many people who have experienced sexual violence didn't disclose what happened to them or did not disclose right away, right? And for those who did, the response may not have been one that they wanted or the one that was the most helpful. So you might be one of the first people, maybe one of the only people that ever gets to hear their story. It's important that we know how to listen and how to listen empathetically. Okay. Now we're going to see an example of this and just kind of notice some of the things that happen in this video.
Most is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah.
Let's see. It didn't start beginning. Sorry, everyone.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't
try to see things my...
Okay. Right. So in that video, we heard him say, like, I think, like, there's a nail in your head. Like, one, he couldn't focus on what she was saying because he was too busy trying to diagnose what he thought was the problem. At one point, he even told her what he thought what the problem was, even though she was telling him directly what she wanted to address, right? And so sometimes this could be what advocacy can feel like. We might think that there's a very obvious solution or a thing that could clearly stop the pain or the trauma that someone's experiencing. But we have to, as advocates, learn to actively listen and focus on what the survivor wants to prioritize or address what they see as the issue. But when we're active listening, we want to make sure that we are giving that person our full attention, right? So even if we are taking notes, we want to express that to the survivor or ask them to pause at certain places so we can take general notes. Generally, we want to face them. We want to make eye contact. And those are, again, just some of the ways that we can proactively communicate what we need to make sure that we're responding to what they need. We also want to be mindful of body language, facial expressions, pacing, and tone. And so these are all parts that feed into how we communicate with people. We know that particularly phone advocacy, you might not be able to see someone's body language, but you can notice their pacing, the tone of their voice, and you might be able to say, like, I noticed that you're pausing a lot. Is everything okay? Did something change? Are you still able to talk? Right? And that's still a way that we're showing that we're paying attention to how that person is communicating. We want to make sure that we keep ourselves regulated so we can be present and pay attention to what is shared. So for those of you who may not be familiar with this term, regulation and regulating is just how we reference how our body is breathing and responding to things that are happening around us. When we are dysregulated, that is when our body is noticing that there might be trauma or changes happening that we need to respond to. So for example, when I'm dysregulated, when I am behind time on my, when I'm running out of time in our trainings, when I am behind schedule on some of the things that I need to do, I know that I feel it in the pit of my stomach. I talk faster and it takes me longer to answer because I feel frozen, right? So we just need to make sure that we are paying attention to the changes that happen in our bodies when we're interacting with survivors. We also want to observe changes we see in the other person and voice them when more appropriate. So I gave an example of that earlier. And we also want to make sure that we're demonstrating validation and encouragement, reframing, and mirroring the language that survivors use. Here are some examples of how we can model empathetic and active listening. We want to try and name, if we can, and restate how that person said that they feel and it felt and validate that emotion. So remember that we as advocates may not be able to fix it or define that problem for them, but we can listen to what's being shared and what's being communicated. It sounds like you felt really upset when your mother brought up what happened to you as a joke. Did I get that right? I heard you say that you felt really frustrated that your hearing was rescheduled. Is that what you said? Is that what I'm hearing? I'm okay with silence if you need time to think or process. And I want to draw attention to this last one because sometimes, especially when talking about trauma and their emotions, people might need a minute to collect their thoughts. When we voice this, people can feel safer to think, make intentional decisions, and not feel rushed for our benefit. And here are some more phrases. You're not responsible for what happened to you. From what it sounds like, the person targeted you because you were vulnerable. It's okay that you didn't remember what happened to you. We know that trauma can affect our memories. These are things that you could say to any survivor, but one of these is really targeting victim blaming and the idea of someone misusing their power. Again, putting the blame on the person that harmed the survivor instead of the survivor for what they may or may not have done regarding the sexual violence that they experienced. Especially if they were sexually abused as a young child or at another point in their life where they might have felt helpless, recognizing and reemphasizing their personal power might be an important part of providing support. So Ari also put several other terms in the chat that are going to be really important. Remember when practicing active and empathetic. Our next skill is choice points. These are moments where people can pause and actively make a decision. And so when we talk about choice points, these are places where people can acknowledge all the individual choices that they can make in their life that can help them when they experience sexual violence, when they are navigating everyday situations. And having and practicing choice points doesn't mean that the choice that they have is going to be favorable or even prevent something bad from happening. But it's just the ability to recognize what they can do and choose to do when at other times in life they didn't have choices. So here's another discussion question. Why might survivors of sexual violence have a difficult time making choices? Why might survivors of sexual violence have a difficult time making choices? They may have a difficult time trusting themselves, decision fatigue, absolutely. May make the choice that their loved ones won't like, and that can cause additional anxiety, even trauma in their lives. Their choice was taken away by the abuse, absolutely, right? Yeah, what else? They need more information, absolutely, right? Um, my team at I'm Constant knows that I am infamous for asking for more questions. Right, I'm a person who feels the most safe when I have the usually the most amount of information possible. Um, Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Okay, some things that we identified, right? And some of these were said in the chat as well. Fear their choices being rejected. Oh, that's a great one. Absolutely, right? I made this choice, but people didn't accept the choice that I made. That can be really difficult. We want to remember that sexual violence in itself is a violation of choice, right? A person did not consent to what happened to them, and so that is a violation of their choice. We also know that sexual violence are blamed for their choices and actions related to the sexual violence they experience and beyond, right? So if you hadn't done this, worn this, been there, not been there, this wouldn't have happened to you, right? Or if you would have spoken up sooner, or if you would have made different choices, this wouldn't have happened to you, right? And these questions are not and things are not usually said to the person that harmed them. Someone mentioned decision fatigue, and yeah, we agree with that, right? There's usually a lot of choices that we make, which can seem overwhelming. And we also know that sometimes survivors may have a pattern or have to defer to someone else to make decisions for them, right? And this can be for children and adults with intellectual and developmental intellectual and developmental disabilities specifically, but this can also just be used to having other people make decisions in our lives for safety, right? We don't trust ourselves to make decisions. It can be to avoid blame or to appease other people, right? So I know if I made the choice that I really wanted, other people will be upset about that. And that's just gonna cause more trauma in my life that I don't want to deal with right now. But when we think about choice versus advocates, we want to make sure that we are curious about what the survivor is saying, right? So we were doing all of our great, really engaged, empathetic, and active listening. And so we're thinking about what choice points are they, what emotions are they voicing? How do they feel about what's going on? We also want to keep track of the choices that are available in their daily life or whatever they're talking about, what they shared with us. And again, this isn't about survivors identifying the choices that they should make. Rather, it's about finding all the choices that they can make about large choices and assisting them in thinking through their options and then supporting the decision that they do make. When we validate survivor choices, it helps them feel more confident in their ability to make the choices that are best for themselves. Particularly when we're talking about advocacy and thinking about advocacy, We want to think about the choices survivors can have before meeting with us, when meeting with us, and after meeting with us. And we want to make sure that we verbalize all these options and not just one. So, for example, would you like the door open or close? I have to leave in 45 minutes. So, do you still want to continue talking or should we stop here? Right? Don't want survivors to think that we are intentionally favoring one or the other because, again, when things are their choice, we need to make sure that that's clearly communicated. We also want to try to keep the options simple as well, or ones that have a definitive answer. Okay, so we have another question. And so Ari, she's so on it. So we have again shared the story of Marco's life with you on the chat, just for reference. But for right now, please, so I'm gonna give you all a minute, focus on reading through Marco's life, and then I'll ask the question. Okay, so here's the scenario. Marco passed out while driving due to exhaustion. He totaled his car and can't afford to get his hearing aids fixed. The next day, he texts you, his advocate, and says he doesn't know what to do next. So, in the chat, if you could please identify what are some choice points that Marco might have. And remember, these are small choices that have definitive answers that he could choose from. What are some choice points you all identify? What are some choice points that Marco has? He wanted to come into the office today to meet in person with his advocate? Absolutely. What else? If you all, pausing if you all need more time to think. Yes. So what are some choices that Marco, so someone asked in the Q&A, can you rephrase your question? Absolutely. So what are some choices that Marco has at this point? Marco can choose to this or that. He can choose to this, this, this. He could not choose to that or this. Is there anyone he can call to help him with car insurance or health insurance or hearing aids? Not having to call them, but identify who he can help with. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Contact his insurance company. Yeah, those are great answers. Thank you all so much. So here are some of the ones that we identified, right? Like some of you all said, contact his insurance, make an accident report, go to urgent care to get a checkup, make a to-do list to write down his options, call his sister and tell her what happened, right? He can even decide when he's gonna contact you the next time, right? get in contact with clinics, etc. to see if an insurance company would call it. Could be connecting with disability organizations with his area, right? All these different things. And they, again, don't have to be directly related to the car accident, right? It could just be getting himself a good breakfast, right? Or talking about how he feels after the accident. All of these different things are choice points that he has, and again, large and small. Here are some ways that we can validate and ask questions to help, again, survivors identify choice points. What decision do you want to make? So instead of focusing on whether that's the right or the wrong thing, how about we focus on, does this decision feel good to you? Whatever decision you make, I will support you. Something else that might be good for you to keep in your back pocket or to keep on hand is, from what you told me, it sounds like you make the decision that's best for you based on the information you had. Or, I can make that choice for you. I'm still gonna support what you decide. What's important for survivors to know is that you're gonna support them in the decision that they make, but you're not gonna step into the role of decision making for them. You have to keep the boundary that we assist with, not decide for. Our role is to help survivors identify their options and choices, and then affirm and validate the choices that they make. Okay, our next skill is safety planning. And I could do so many webinars on sexual violence safety planning alone, but again, we've only got about 20 more minutes left in this training. But safety planning is a plan to help survivors keep themselves safe in a holistic manner. And the key part for us at Iowa CASA is that holistic piece. We know that a lot of times the place that survivors feel the most unsafe is in their bodies and in their minds, right? And instead, the danger happens when they are triggered or activated after experiencing trauma, right? So you might hear us refer to this as a safety trigger or emotional safety plan for that reason. It's important for us to remember people can control when they're triggered or what triggers them, and their triggers may evolve over time, and they also can discover new ones, right? So with new experiences, they might discover new triggers. For example, people might find out that they are experience trauma and are triggered during childbirth, right? That is an experience for a lot of sexual violence survivors. Okay, so now we're gonna watch another short video talking about triggers. Give me a second while I scroll to find the point.
Scared, a deep kind of primordial part of our brain says, get out of here fast, run. Or that part of our brain might say, freeze, don't move, don't let anyone pay attention to you. And it is a reaction that happens in microseconds. For sexual violence survivors, the violence that was done to them was done by another human being. It was done by hands and mouths and genitals. And so for sexual violence survivors, that part of their brain encodes a lot of basic human interactions as terrifying and as danger signals. So triggers will be unique to every survivor. It might be a song that comes on the radio because they were sexually assaulted during that song when it was playing. It could be the scent of a certain cologne. It could also be attempting to feel trust or love with someone. The majority of people who commit sexual violence against children pick someone close to them. They pick someone that trusts them. And so moving into adulthood, oftentimes basic human interactions, basic human emotions can be terrifying for a survivor to feel. So the first step in managing triggers for all survivors.
Okay. So that video is available on the Research Sharing Project YouTube channel. If you all want to be watching it, it's a great video. It's less than 10 minutes long, and so I encourage you to look it up.
Is to
Okay. So when we're talking about trigger planning, this should be a larger part of our holistic safety plan. And a safety plan has these three basic elements. They're short and easy to remember, and this is a plan that can be done from memory. If someone's having to write down their safety plan, it's too long and has too many steps, and they'll spend more time trying to remember it than they'll be able to use it during a crisis. It should be practiced and established, and the person should try to come up with it when they feel calm and regulated, and practice it so they have ideas about how it will feel before they're in the emergency or in the crisis. And then also it should be determined by the holistic needs of the person that needs support. My safety plan is not going to look like Ari's, even if it might include similar elements. Well, these are some questions that you all can use when you are trying to do trigger planning with survivors, right? And these, again, are helping survivors come back to a more calm and elevated state after they might be triggered or re-traumatized in that moment. What are my triggers? When I'm triggered, what happens in my body? How do I feel? When I'm triggered, what do I need to feel calm? When I'm triggered, what can help me regulate myself and feel centered and come back to feeling in control and in tune with my own body, my own needs, and the present moment? When I'm triggered, what can other people around me do to help me calm down? And what are some things people around me should not do to help me calm down? These last two are important because sometimes the way people respond or want to help can be re-traumatizing or cause additional trauma in the lives of survivors. So we especially want to talk about this and let people know if someone else is a part of our safety plan. Okay. And this is our last chat and discussion question for the day. So I'm going to give you all a minute to read through this, and then I will read it out loud. Okay, now I'm going to read it out loud. When Marco's scholarship was not renewed, he had to change schools. He expressed to you that he's been vomiting for the last week when he thinks about starting his new school, especially without all his friends. So what is one thing that you would say to safety plan with Marco? And bonus points if you can use some of those skills that we've already talked about today. What is one thing you could say or you might suggest to help Marco with a safety plan? What are some questions you might ask? What are some things you might say? What are some suggestions you might offer? like we're a little quiet, so I'm just gonna keep moving so we can make sure we get all the content for today. Some of the things that we thought about, we might say like, Marco, that sounds really difficult. What do you think can help you instead of starting school? With this one in particular, right, we're not suggesting that he not go to school because that's not an option, right? Making sure that we're framing the choices that he can make, and making sure that making sure that we're framing the choices that he does have to make and not just focusing on the choices he doesn't have access to. Let Marco know that you hear and understand his fears. Absolutely right. That's a great suggestion, I think. Matt, like I heard sometimes breathing in through your nose can help with nausea. Do you want to practice that? And it sounds like your friends are really important to you. What's a good way to help you stay connected to them? Right. So again, demonstrating the active listening, talking about who else can be really important for Marco's emotional safety, and also addressing some of the physical symptoms that he's experiencing as a result of what's going on in his life. So that breathing exercise that we last mentioned from Marco goes into our next skill, which is grounding. And the definition that we have here is a little bit concrete, but I still think it's a good way to describe what it is. And Ari put another resource in the chat for you all. This one is a webinar that talks about dissociation and grounding, specifically for adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Grounding is the feeling of being present and connected to the here and now. And this can be really hard for some survivors of sexual violence who might dissociate or find themselves feeling numb after what happened, right? It's hard to feel anything. When we mindfully try to ground ourselves, we can work to disrupt the triggers, what's disconnecting our bodies. Now, grounding might be a part of someone's larger safety plan, and there are many different grounding techniques, modalities, or whatever word you like to use to talk about grounding. But what's the most important is that this is something that helps that survivor connect what's going on in their bodies, particularly while they're triggered. So like I said, there's a lot of different grounding techniques, and the more you know, the better you'll be able to help all survivors, right? Because we all have different needs and different things help us feel grounded. So what we're gonna do right now is practice 2 of these different techniques. So this first one that we're gonna do is called Fern. And so I encourage you all to do this with me. So you can do this activity eyes open or closed. And whenever you start to feel comfortable, you are going to tighten every part of your body as tight as feels comfortable. So for me, that is curling up my hands, bringing them to my chest, bringing my head down to my shoulders, and bringing my knees up to my chest, right? So as tight as I possibly can together. And then whenever you would like, start to loosen that tension. Start to unfurl your hands, maybe relax your shoulders, put your arms back in a sitting position, stretch, and then take a deep breath. And so this is a grounding tool that we can use. Again, even if we can't see the survivor, they can do on their own, and they don't need any additional resources to be able to do this technique. All right, so the next one that we have is about boundaries. And so we're gonna do this grounding technique too, okay? So while listening to your body, you can do this activity both sitting and standing, eyes open and closed, but again, listen to what your body needs in this moment. In your head or out loud, I invite you to think about situations in which you would say yes, no, and maybe too. When you say no, place your hands on your chest and move them forward with your palms facing up as if you're pushing something away from you. No. No. When you say maybe, place your palms down by your side while facing down as if you were trying to keep something from getting past you. So, no. Or sorry, maybe. 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 When you want to say yes, hold your hands down by your sides with your palms facing up, as if you were receiving a welcome gift. Yes. Yes. So practice asking yourself questions in which you can answer no, maybe, and yes to, and do those different movements at a pace that feels comfortable for you. Do you want to take off after this? Would you like pizza for lunch? Do you want the webinar to end on time? So when you're going through that, notice how your body and mind feel in regard to the different responses. How do you feel when you say yes, no, and maybe? What happens in your body? What changes do you notice? So whenever you're ready, feel free to stop. So thank you all for participating in that activity. And just, again, keep in mind how those felt. And now that you've done it, you can also think about how that might feel with the survivors that you're working with. And that feeds into our next skill, which is boundary work, right? And boundary work is the limits and rules we set for ourselves within relationships. Now we know that people who experience sexual violence may have issues with boundaries, right? And that's because they might be used to and often have those different boundaries violated. But when we're talking about boundary work, we try to emphasize, and this is a quote from Prentice Hemphill, boundaries are the distance that I can love you and me respectfully. Boundaries are important because sexual violence in itself is a boundary violation, right? That sets the foundation for people to continuously have other boundaries violated in other parts of their lives. So when we're doing boundary work, these are some things that we want to reinforce. We want to remember that they deserve to feel safe and to make choices for themselves. We want them to think about how to set boundaries in a clear and consistent way and strategize around events and times that they may feel pressured to be around people who might press against their boundaries. Not only do we want people to be able to set their own boundaries and maintain them, but we also want them to be able to recognize and respect other people's boundaries as well. So this can be things with physical touch. I know in a lot of different cultures, giving a hug and a kiss is customary, but making sure survivors can hold their own boundaries, but also respecting them and others. Is it okay that I take this pen off Ari's desk without asking, right? That boundary is gonna look different for every person, and we don't wanna assume or have survivors assume other people's boundaries as well. So here are some things we can say and how people practice when we're talking about boundaries. We can ask survivors, what would a boundary with them look like for you? Talking about boundaries can be difficult. Do you want to practice with me? You set a boundary and they didn't respect that. That's on them. At first, especially I know for advocates who are helpers, right? This might seem awkward, uncomfortable, and anxious, but the only way to become more comfortable with boundary setting is to continue to do so. All right, everyone. And so we went over a lot of skills today, and each of these can be difficult to do and start in practice. But the more that we do it, the better we'll get, and we're all constantly learning and improving. So if you need support, please feel free to reach out to us. And with that, that is the end of our webinar today. Do you all have any questions? Okay. If you do have questions, I'm going to stay on for a little bit, but I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you and have a great day.